Well, meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin called for a self-purification of society to eliminate anti-war Russians. In a televised address, Putin attacked NATO for manipulating anti-war sentiment and branded Russians who opposed the war as scum and traitors. Thousands of anti-war demonstrators have so far been arrested, and journalist Marina Ovsyannikova has been held for 14 hours for her protest on Russian television. I want to bring in Samuel Romani now, who is an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Samuel, Putin's speech came at a time when peace negotiators, including from the side of the Ukrainians, had been talking about a more reasonable tone from the Russians. But listening to his speech, it did seem inconsistent with that, didn't it?
Well, definitely, it basically signifies the fact that even though Vladimir Putin is sending his negotiators to talk to the Ukrainians, he is still expanding the war. And he's expanding the war on Odessa, he's expanding the war on Western Ukraine, and he's also cracking down on dissent at home. So his actions and his rhetoric are basically going in two different directions.
So let's talk about the vocabulary then for a moment. Just some of the choice words used: traitors, scum, cleansing, and the fifth column. There was some particularly scary language used here.
Definitely, yeah. And this language is not entirely new either, because after the annexation of Crimea in March of 2014, Vladimir Putin warned precisely of the threat posed by Western countries enabling fifth columns within Russia to oppose Russia's conduct in Ukraine. So he basically has just repackaged his rhetoric, but in a much more strident and virulent form. And now he's not just targeting Russians who might be liberal and opposed to the war, but he's also targeting Russians living abroad and also oligarchs who have been used to Western lifestyles, like the French Riviera and Miami Villa comment suggested.
Yeah, let's touch on that for a bit, because he does appear to be now suppressing dissent from oligarchs in the West, which brings me to the question, I guess. What is his specific concern when it comes to the oligarchs?
Well, a number of oligarchs now have effectively been calling for a peaceful resolution. So we've seen one of the largest magnates in fertilizer and agriculture do that. We've seen Oleg Deripaska, who's even a very close ally of Putin, who's been sanctioned in the past for his relationship with him, speak out. We've even seen Roman Abramovich, who has not been explicitly critical of Putin, also agree before he was sanctioned, at least, to donate the proceeds of Chelsea Football Club to Ukrainian refugees and Ukrainians suffering from the war. So we're seeing a dissent amongst the expatriate oligarch ranks, and Russia's trying to rein that in, and he's trying to send a message to them.
Does this speech give any insight into Putin's state of mind right now?
Well, I think it's not necessarily a sign of a radical change in his state of mind. I think there's a lot of consistencies in his rhetoric, as I've noted, from 2014 onwards. But what is different now, this time around, is that Vladimir Putin is basically internalizing some of the most extreme rhetoric coming from members of the Duma or some of his closest advisors and making that his own. That's probably the biggest difference in terms of rhetoric. Whether that's a sign of just new messaging or a change in his state of mind is too premature to tell.
So aside then from the oligarchs and trying to crack down on dissent there, what about for the average Russian? Somebody who's still in Russia, who's not an activist, who's not a journalist. What does this speech signify for how they could be treated if they don't agree with his war in Ukraine?
What we've seen is a staggering amount of repression of dissent already inside Russia. We've seen as many as 16,000 people who were arrested in the first 2.5 weeks of the anti-war protests. Though some estimates run a little lower than that, it still gives you an indication of the amount of repression that we're seeing. We're seeing martial law, 15 years in prison if people are say the wrong thing about the war, even call it a war and not a special military operation. So this kind of repression is aimed at rallying Russians around the flag and around this war, and basically framing anybody who does not support the war as unpatriotic. And his surrogates like Margarita Simonian, who heads RT, and his press secretary Dmitry Peskov have also been pushing this narrative aggressively too.